The third version of the gospel, or the third understanding of the gospel, comes to us from Luke. We believe that Luke not only wrote the gospel, but he wrote it as a 2-volume. The first volume talking about the life and the person and the work of Jesus, and the second volume, the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, connected to the work of the church and how the church then began to live out the things that Jesus taught. And of course, you see that particularly through the eyes of Paul. And so we believe that Paul was the inspiration for Luke. Now that needs to give you immediately a pause for thought. Because of course, Paul himself also didn't know Jesus. Or did he? Well, if you read Paul's letters, you realize that Paul believed that his meeting on the Damascus Road was not with a vision of God, was not with an angel of God, but in fact that his connection on the Damascus Road was with the risen Jesus. Now we can see that, and we'll talk about that later when we get to the module on Paul, is that that's what Paul felt was his call. He wasn't just called by God to be a disciple, he was called by Jesus himself. And so the concepts within Paul's understanding, and we'll see it as I said earlier in Paul's letters, is very much of a risen Jesus, of the Jesus exalted, the Jesus resurrected. But he didn't know the Jesus who was on earth. Potentially he was still at that point, or in the time of Jesus, he was still in Asia Minor, where he came from. And so we see that there's a different thing. We know that Luke, therefore, must have had other sources. In fact, he writes to a particular person, or at least it could be a person, or might be a group of people. He writes to Theophilus. Theophilus, which of course is from 2 Greek words again, theo meaning God, and philis coming from the word philia, which is friendship or brotherly love, but a friend would be the best translation. And so Theophilus is a friend of God. It may have been someone called Theophilus, it may have been someone's nickname, or it might be that Luke is writing to anyone who is a friend of God. And that's how we connect it also with the book of Acts, because of course both books begin in chapter 1 in the same way, that he has made a careful account of this, my dear Theophilus. In the book of Acts, of course, the first part of the book of Acts is written in the third person, but then the second part of the book of Acts begins to be written in the first person. So we see that's when Luke began to be the companion of Paul and used to travel with Paul. And so, of course, most of the second half of Acts is really connected to Paul's journeys and what Paul was doing rather than what was happening to the church in Jerusalem. So when was Luke written? Well, again, we're not sure. Was it written before Paul was killed? And some people believe that, particularly because the book of Acts doesn't end with his crucifixion, or with his beheading, in fact, for Paul. It doesn't end there. And so because we don't have any story of the end of Paul's life, some commentaries have said that most probably Luke was writing before then. Now, if we estimate that Paul was killed in around about 63 AD, then it was written before 63. However, if we say that Mark was written in 65, and that Luke used Mark as a template, then obviously there needed to be some time for Mark to circulate around the Roman world. In that case, most probably, again, our best estimate could be that Luke Acts is written somewhere around 75 AD. Somewhere around 75 AD. And what that would have given, it would have given Luke some time to think through what Paul had said. It would have given some time to think through what had happened in the journeys and in the connections that they had had. Maybe it was time for him to put together some of the notes or diaries that he had written over that period to put them together into something more coherent. At least that's what we assume. But what we do know about Luke is that the writing of Luke uses a Greek that is very good. It uses a Greek that has got lots of variety, it's got good grammar and good connection. And so what that means is that most probably Luke was Greek speaking. Some have said that in fact his Greek is so good that it would seem as if he wasn't even Jewish. He most probably was Greek. I would disagree with that in the sense that I believe that by the time Paul comes along, which is in the early 50s, by that stage it's too early for a Gentile to have already become a companion of one of the Jewish leaders. I believe that Luke was a Jew, but a Jew that, like Paul, came from the diaspora, came from the Jewish dispersion, possibly even came from the same area as Paul, which is why Paul and Luke used to get on so well together, and why they became companions, and why, in fact, Luke became one of the confidants of Paul. But at the same time, obviously, Luke must have had some relationship with the Jews of Jerusalem so that he could get the information that he needed in order to write the first part or the first volume of his book. So what we could say then is that most probably Luke was somebody who wrote from the diaspora, so from the Roman Empire or the Hellenized Empire, to the churches in the Hellenized Empire. There's a mixture of a Jewish flavor, but also a mixture of a Gentile flavor within his book. And so most probably writing to that church, which is beginning to change, is beginning to get more Gentiles into the process as well. In one of his letters, Paul refers to Luke as my dear physician. And that has often made us talk about Dr. Luke. Of course, that's not useful for us really, because the truth is that there were no real doctors in the Jewish frame. If you had a sickness or had a problem, you didn't go to a doctor, you went to the priest. And often the priests were educated in the various maladies and afflictions of the time. If you had leprosy, it was the priest who would declare you a leper and would ostracize you from the community. In the same way, when you then were healed as a leper, you went to the priest, and the priest would declare you clean and allow you back into community again. So maybe Luke was a priest. Maybe Luke had a priestly connection, but the least that we can say is that he was educated. He was a highly educated man, similar in many ways to Paul, and so therefore an appropriate companion to Paul in the midst of that process. We also can say, therefore, is that it's most probably written to a much broader audience than some of the others as well. And when we come to terms with that, in our next clip, we'll look at what was he trying to achieve in that process.